Glad you guys are back, safe and sound.
Thank you, Rabbi. We're back.
Good. But and the boys enjoyed it, I hope.
Yes, they loved it.
Oh, great, great. How long is Josh going to be over there?
He's gonna be there for 1 more week,
Oh,
so I think he will come back the same day next week.
okay. Very nice. All right. Good, good. Well,
How
glad
are
you.
you doing? Do you feel better?
Oh yeah, yeah. We're fine. We are fine. And yeah, we're doing just no effects, no after effects. I think. Although people told me about COVID brain, which, of course, in my case, I can't tell the difference, so it doesn't matter. Okay.
That's great.
Um, so today we are going to talk about Shabbat the how, and I even did a PowerPoint. Let's see, what do I want to do here? So what we're going to talk about today is what does it mean to observe Shabbat? What's malacha? Because that's often misunderstood. We say you shouldn't work on Shabbat. Well, in our world, work on Shabbat means, if I'm a mailman, I don't go deliver the mail on Saturday. But that's not what is forbidden to do on Shabbat. But I also want to say, I'm going to start. I just want to warn everybody. I am starting with a traditional understanding of Shabbat observance. And the reason why I'm saying I'm warning it, because by the time I get to the end of this, you may say, what the hell? I'm never doing this. I mean, who would ever want to observe Shabbat? But I just want to explain how, what traditional observance looks like and what the concerns are. And then at the conclusion, I want to talk about, well, how should we observe Shabbat? What's the best way to observe Shabbat? I want to go back again to that quotation a quotation from Abraham Joshua Heschel. We looked at it last week, where he said, "This is what the ancient rabbis felt. The Sabbath demands all of man's attention." Again, that's his language. I noticed that a lot of these guys in the 50s and 60s were writing about, or not, they're not gender sensitive as we are today. So demands all of man's attention, the service and single-minded devotion of total love. The logic of such a conception compelled them to enlarge constantly the system of laws and rules of observance. They sought to ennoble human nature and make it worthy of being in the presence of the royal day. And then he continued, he said, continuous austerity may severely dampen, yet levity would certainly obliterate the spirit of the day. One cannot modify a precious filigree with a spear or operate on a brain with a plowshare. I think what he means by this is that Shabbat's so special that we want to make sure that we want to think through all of our activities on Shabbat. And therefore, and we'll see as we go through some of the categories of melacha, how the taxonomy of these categories is really interesting, how they kind of thought through what each of these forbidden activities constituted. And so therefore, that's what he's saying. If you care about something, you're not going to just say, plowing means, don't take your plow out. Well, we don't have plows anymore, so therefore it doesn't teach us anything. No, they're going to say, we're going to try to understand, what is the meaning of plowing? How does a person who doesn't plow, what are the things that are similar to it, and how do we connect with it? So I think that's what I'm, so Heschel, who was a traditional Jew, but writing for people who were not traditional, was just trying to explain why it seems that these rules are so burdensome and so heavy. But I did have in the little corner here, he also said this: in their illustrious fear of desecrating the spirit of the day, the ancient rabbis established a level of observance which is within the reach of exalted souls, but not frequently beyond the grasp of ordinary men or women. And then he also said, one must sacrifice mitzvot for the sake of man rather than sacrifice man for the sake of the mitzvot. The purpose of the Torah is to bring life to Israel in this world and the world to come. And I think that's really where I want to focus eventually, but I do think it's important. And a lot of times, unfortunately, my experience has been, or what I've seen, is that certainly in the Reform movement, because of their attitude towards mitzvot, which is, good idea, but you don't have to do it. And even in the conservative movement, where sometimes we just kind of, we gloss over what it means to observe Shabbat. And then you see Orthodox Jews and you think they're all weirdos or something. And it's not. They're actually, they're trying to fulfill what Heschel's writing here. So I want to start there, and then we'll go back and say, well, what about us? Okay? So here, let's start first with a definition of work. This is what we saw last week with Eric Fromm. Eric Fromm said, work is any interference by man, again, human being, be it constructive or destructive, with the physical world. Rest is a state of peace between man and nature. So his understanding is, and we're going to see, Diane Isidore Grunfeld, which is the author of the book I suggested. I don't know what I do with it now, but the author of the book, The Sabbath, very short book. And we're going to look at passages in it tonight. Very close to what he has. He says any act, malacha, is any act that shows human mastery over the world by the constructive exercises of one's intelligence and skill. So I think the only thing that Rabbi Grunfeld adds to Eric Fromm is the idea that malacha also requires, well, he uses the term intelligence here, but he also explains in the book that it requires intention, that you have to intend to do these things. And he explains that actually, if you're completely destructive without any thought of being constructive, like if you're just tearing up a sheet of paper and and with no intention of using it for anything, that's actually technically not malacha, because malacha has to be constructive. But in the end, you still can't tear up a piece of paper for no reason at all. And as we'll see, because of what we call a siyag laTorah, the rabbis put a fence around the Torah to make sure that we didn't do anything intentionally, and so, or we didn't do the actual, we didn't transgress the actual mitzvot regarding Shabbat, and so they put a bubble around it so that there's actually many more things that we're not supposed to be doing that technically the Torah wouldn't say is melacha, but we want to make sure we don't even trample on that, and so we create this wider area of things we're not supposed to do. But in both of these cases, Eric Fromm, who I don't think, he may have been raised as an Orthodox Jew. I don't think he lived as an Orthodox Jew. He was a famous psychoanalyst. But both of them understand that melacha is some kind of constructive, and Fromm adds destructive, act with the physical world, and showing that we have mastery. Isidore Grunfeld has, in his description of the meaning of Shabbat, he focuses very much on Shabbat is a humbling experience because there's only one creator, and therefore by pulling back, by ceasing to act, which is what God did as well in the creation experience, but by ceasing, we have at least one day of the week where we recognize we don't run the world. We don't master the world. God is the true master. So, all right. So here are the 39 categories of malacha, and these are the broader categories. And you can see here, most of them are actions: plowing, sowing, reaping, sheaf making, threshing, winnowing, selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, baking. These first 11 are also obviously all related to the agricultural world. Number 12, sheep shearing, bleaching, combing raw materials, dyeing, spinning, weaving operations, separating into threads, tying a knot, untying a knot, sewing, tearing. These all have to do with basically clothes making. And then starting with 24, no, sorry, 25, trapping or hunting, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, scraping pelts, marking out, cutting to shape. Um, these obviously have to do with how we're dealing with killing an animal and creating something from the animal. And then we have writing and erasing, building, which is kind of a broad category, demolishing in the sense of tearing something down to build something up, kindling a fire. That's one of the, as we saw last week, that's one of the very few specific mitzvot in the Torah that you can't do on Shabbat. Extinguishing. So obviously, if you can, kindle a fire, you're not supposed to extinguish it. And then these last two, the final hammer blow. That's really kind of an all-inclusive. That's like anything that you're finishing a project you can't in any way you're not supposed to do. And then comes the one that's a little bit odd, carrying from the private to the public domain. I thought that it's actually Eric Fromm had a really nice explanation of that, where carrying is about property, and property is the basis for human interactions, or I shouldn't say human interactions, but property is a basic element in social interactions and creating division in society. And so moving things is connected, actually, according to Fromm, with property and moving property around. But it's an interesting one. It's not carrying. It's not meaning carrying something heavy. That's is toil. It's not an issue of toil. It's moving from one domain to another, a private domain to a public domain, or within a public domain, and vice versa. So these are the 39 categories. The tradition tells us, and Heschel's book points this out as well, that, and this is very common in Heschel's writings, this bifurcation between the duality and binary. So in space, in his book, time and space are opposites, and Shabbat is sanctity in time, and the rest of the week is sanctity in space. We're working on sanctity in space, sanctifying space. And so, and that's based on a understanding in the Midrashim that the 39 categories of Malacha are related to the 39 types of categories involved in building the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, the tabernacle. That's holiness in space. And you needed all these activities to do that, because there were grain offerings that were made, and so that's all of the agricultural actions. There were animal sacrifices that were made, and as well as the tabernacle itself was made out of various kinds of what's the word I'm looking for? Fabrics. Yeah, Roy?
Yeah, hey, sorry to interrupt. I've been thinking about this since last week, and I was just curious where I see writing and erasing is on there, but I was just curious where reading or study or that kind of, like, where intellectual labors fit in Shabbat, whether they're, I mean, there's some Torah study, obviously, that goes, right. I mean, we read together. So, right. But I mean, where's the line and what's been said about that kind of work on Shabbat?
Right. So that's very interesting. No problem with reading, no problem with study. Having intellectual conversations, all of these things are acceptable, which is why sometimes it's very hard to come up with a complete, all-inclusive definition of melacha, because here Diane Grunfeld said any act shows human mastery over the world by constructive exercises of one's intelligence. Well, you could say reading a book, but it's not. It's just writing and the opposite, erasing. So reading isn't a problem. Study is not a problem. In fact, they're encouraged. Now, some, to be, wait, I guess if I want to be more specific, some rabbis suggested that the things we study and the things we read on Shabbat should be holy texts. They should be Torah. They should be something that elevates us, not secular material. You shouldn't read a newspaper. All right. I mean, that, well, for some, that's what they're going to say. But really, reading is fine. There's nothing wrong with reading or studying.
Thanks.
Okay. Wait. Let's see. What do I want to get? Oh, so the plowing has to do with grains which you're using for, which were grain sacrifices that were brought. The animal stuff is the fabrics that you're creating as well. There's also animal sacrifices, but it's the fabrics that are made for the priest and for the tabernacle. All these things are necessary. So you have different types. You have the skinning of animals is also. I mean, they're using it to either for some of the leather fabrics and also a Torah scroll, and writing, erasing, building. All these things are involved in creating the holy space of the tabernacle. That's one midrash. Kindling a fire. There was always a fire going in the tabernacle, and I suppose carrying was also an activity. So that's one of the understandings that here, and the 39 categories are the things that were used. 39 categories of activities to build this holy space, and we refrain from those activities on the Sabbath when it's holy time. Okay, so now making a fence around the Torah. This is really important in terms of understanding some of the extended limitations that we have. Again, because plowing, I mean, if all I have to worry about is not plowing, it's not a big deal. I don't usually I don't even like, doing it during the week. So, of, getting the garden ready. So, but what is plowing? So then there are all these extended restrictions. But this is what Diane Grunfeld says in the book. In matters of such seriousness, even unthinking transgressions must be guarded against. It is a very poor excuse when fundamental questions of this nature are at stake to say, I wasn't thinking. Sabbath presents special dangers in this respect, since it concerns actions that we are in the habit of doing all the other 6 days of the week. Jews at all times, conscious of all that is at stake, have been determined not to be dragged down from their high purposes by habit and forgetfulness. They have therefore sought ways and means of protection against unintentional Sabbath breaking. The sages have given practical effect to this endeavor by means of protective legislation, which we call siyag la Torah, or erecting a fence around the law, around the Torah. A prohibition of this kind is called a gizerah. So gizerah is a rabbinical decree. It means that it's not something that the rabbis saw in the Torah directly, but they themselves, taking upon themselves the role of authority, decree that these things shouldn't be done. Now, there's a special name for it when it comes to Shabbat laws. It's called a shvut. So gizerah is any kind of rabbinical decree, but a shvut is specifically those connected to Shabbat. And here are 3 examples of them. Although not themselves melachot, right, these categories of melacha, they could very easily lead to our doing melacha. So here are some of the possibilities. They outwardly resemble melacha, and so can easily be confused with them. So, we'll see in a moment a few of the examples. Because they are linked with melachot by habit in everyday life, because the act itself normally involves or easily leads to a melacha in practice. So if you do it, the act is okay, but if you're doing it, it's likely it'll lead to something you're not supposed to do. So those 3 types of activities were limited, and that makes many more restrictions on our Shabbat activities. I wanted to say one other thing. I forgot to put this on. This is presentation. There's 2 other terms you should know as here, let's look at it right here. We're going to look at one example, grinding. There is an Av Melacha and a Tolada. Av literally is the father, but it's the top category. That's like the rubric. And then you have these derivative categories that come from it, which are also just as they're the same level of restriction. They're all considered to be Torah rules, but the Av is the main one. So the Av in this case of grinding. So what's grinding? And here they explain, this is the understanding of grinding. It's any activity by which a natural product or other substance is divided by means of an appropriate instrument into small particles in order to make better use of it. So grinding is not just about, I turned on my, I got coffee and I put it in the grinder to get it. No. It's any activity in which which the product itself is going to be made into little pieces. And the point is, by making it in those littler, smaller pieces, you can make better use of it. So grinding is what we would call the Av, and the Tolada is literally descendant, is milling or grinding corn, coffee or pepper, filing metals, pounding or crushing substances in a mortar. These are all these are all Torah restrictions. But then we get to the Gezerot, and he's going to give us some examples of the Gezerot. Here he says A, B, and C. This is A was, they look outwardly, they resemble a malacha. So grating vegetables or cheese by means of a grater, right? I mean, that is not exactly forbidden. It's not the grinding activity that perhaps the Torah was referring to, because again, you're talking about things like grinding corn professionally. But if you grate your vegetables or you grate cheese in a hand grater, it kind of looks like you're doing what the actual malacha isn't. You're not supposed to do. So that would be forbidden. Rubbing off clots of dried mud or clay from boots or clothes. Well, you say, huh? Well, it's because it looks a little bit like you're pulling off, it's like you're grinding off the mud with especially if you have like one of those what do they call them? It's like a little metal thing that you get to the front of your door and you scrape off the dirt from your shoes. Well, that looks like it kind of looks like it resembles too closely. So that's an example of a gezerah of the A status, the resembling one. The habit type is, now this, the reason why I brought this up is because this was a really interesting discussion that occurred in my halacha class in rabbinical school. So we were learning about this, and it says to prepare medicine, to take medicine, and to carry out any treatment for the relief or discomfort or pain of slight ailments. Since all of these things are habitually connected with the pounding of medicinal ingredients. Now, this is really interesting, and this was the part of the interesting discussion we had in this halakha class. So somebody said, that's crazy. Nobody grinds their medicine anymore. You don't go, 100 years ago, maybe, there was still people who would grind things up. And, but today, you get it in a little tablet. So traditional, again, this is a traditional, the Orthodox approach would be that you don't take any medicine, because again, it's that habit that we looked up here, that they're linked with malachot by habit in every day. So the habit is, we grind stuff up all the time. Well, if to get the medicine, you grind it up a little bit, or the pharmacist grinds it up to give you the medicine, you might be tempted to start grinding other things just because you wouldn't think, there's nothing wrong with it. Here's another example of that. Rabbi Gettinger, who used to be the Orthodox rabbi in town, once told me a member of his congregation, when he was in New York, was a doctor. Well, a doctor can drive, to save a life, you can, all these things go out the window. And the doctor, um, who's a member of the congregation, saw that Rabbi Gettinger was walking to the synagogue in the afternoon on Shabbat, and he was going to the hospital, obviously an emergency, he was called in. So he's driving. He sees Rabbi Gettinger and he thinks he's being a nice guy. And he says, Rabbi Gettinger, you want me to give you a ride to the synagogue? And of course, Rabbi was like, what? It's Shabbos, But again, the habit is we drive during the week. This doctor had a permission to drive at that moment. But once he would have the permission to drive for the emergency, it goes out the window. He's just assuming, yeah, oh, I see my rabbi there. I'll help him. I'll give him a drop him off at the synagogue on my way to the hospital. So that's what the habit issue is. All right, so here's the medicine thing in this class that I was taking. So the professor says you can't, no medicine. So somebody says, Dr. Diamond, that's crazy. Nobody grinds medicine anymore. And his response was, did you ever have a child who needed aspirin? And so he's thinking in terms of that there still might be a reason to grind up child's aspirin. To which my sister-in-law, who teaches Talmud, when I told her this, she said, does Rabbi Diamond not know about what's the disease that the kids get if they take, we don't give kids child aspirin anymore. So even that goes out the window. I just thought it was such a fascinating discussion. It's like, well, what still holds? Because obviously, as we're talking about this, Gezerot are rabbinic enactments. But if it's not true anymore that anybody ever, or 99%, I mean, how nobody at their home would ever grind up their medicine to take it, then why would you be worried about that? We don't do that. So in this case, it was just a really interesting back and forth where the professor is saying, well, there's still reasons to be concerned. And here my sister-in-law is saying, no, there isn't, because you would never give your kid child aspirin anymore. Elliot, you had a...
Well, I was just gonna say, when I was a kid, there was a point where I was having to take like an antibiotic or something like that was too big for me to swallow. So my mom did have to crush it up and like put it in yogurt.
Okay. All right. Very good. So you've just proven my sister-in-law wrong, and Rabbi Diamond correct. But yes. So that's their concern, is that if we're used to grinding things up during the week for all types of reasons, and then somebody needs medicine, and we grind it up, then we'll forget that it's Shabbat, just like that doctor will forget it's Shabbat, and we'll start, we'll go and we'll grind other things that we shouldn't be grinding. So that's very interesting. So that's what the habit is, the habit type. Jim, yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, just real quickly, and I think I already know the answer to this, but you're allowed to cut your food on your plate to eat it, aren't you?
Right. So I think the distinction is, well, there's two kind of, but one is definitely cutting your food to eat it is just cutting it in smaller pieces. But the grinding, what do we have here? It was, I mean, I guess a person could question the technical aspect of it, is cutting into small pieces, but grinding is usually even smaller, finer particles. Maybe that's why he uses the term particles here. So it's not cutting it up into smaller pieces, it's grinding it or cutting it into smaller particles.
Well, you're not even allowed to tear stuff though, right? So, I mean, I assume cutting something is the equivalent of tearing, which doesn't require going to the molecular level.
Right. Well, the other thing is that there are a lot of often there's a distinction made between food, any kind of food issue that you're cutting, or you, like you mentioned, tearing, when you're going to eat it at that moment.
Okay.
So in fact, let me get to the, wait, did I do this one? No, the there's another one of the other restrictions. One of the other categories is threshing. So okay, so threshing is. Oh wait, let's look up his definition of it. Or not his. Yeah, his definition is a really good one. Threshing is comprises every activity by which a natural product, solid or liquid, is separated from its husk or other natural container or from the organic whole of which it is a part. So again, you think of threshing, you're like, what does that have to do with my life? Well, actually, when you squeeze juice into a glass, that falls under the category of threshing. Um, what's interesting to me is that if you, what did they say? That if you, there are certain types of activity, like you can't squeeze orange juice into a glass. That is forbidden. However, there are other things that you can do. Oh. You can squeeze, and I don't know exactly what the principle is here, but this is a halacha. If you have if you have salmon, you can take lemon and squeeze a little bit of the lemon onto the salmon to help it taste better. But you can't squeeze the lemon to make lemonade. So there's an example, and you can't just squeeze the lemon. You've got to squeeze it onto the piece of fish, because in that case, you're making the fish taste better, at least for yourself, and that's okay in the moment. You're eating it. But to just for the sake of, in that case, like threshing or squeezing out the juice, that's not permissible. So you can see how these things get very fine distinctions here.
Can you break an egg? I'm sorry for interrupting. I just may as well. Can you break an egg?
I think you can break an egg. I'm trying to think of why you. I'm not. I guess I have to look into that, but I think you can break an egg, so that wouldn't fall under the. But you, again, breaking that egg if you were going to eat it. I guess if you
Right.
have Caesar dressing, maybe that would be okay. Yeah, I suppose that would be. Okay.
I didn't know if that's separating it from like the contents from the container, like as in squeezing an orange.
I don't think that would fall under threshing. So again,
Okay.
you see these are fine distinctions. I'm sorry, Elliot, you had a question?
I was just gonna put in my 2 cents about the breaking the egg. I feel like if you were gonna break it into a frying pan in order to eat it right then, that would be different from breaking it into a mixing bowl to like make bread.
Right. Well, we're going to get right down to the point where you definitely couldn't break it into a frying pan. And here's why.
Right.
Because baking is one of the things we don't do on Shabbat. So baking here, again, the principle, or at least the definition that Rabbi Grunfeld gives, is any activity which changes the state of a substance by means of heat, thereby improving it for consumption. So that improvement is necessary, a part of this activity too. So he says here, milachot. Here are the milachot. So that was the av, the main rubric, and here are the derivatives. Cooking in all its forms, so any kind of cooking. Heating water to over 104 Fahrenheit. The reason why 104, that is understood to be the temperature at which point most people would, if they touched it, they would pull their hand back. That it's so hot, they would pull their hand back. And that's the criteria for heating in this case. Adding ingredients to a boiling pot. So if the pot is, and we'll get to it in a moment, that there is a possibility for having an already boiling pot going on Shabbat. But if it is, you can't add ingredients to it. That would be cooking. Stirring the boiling food, because you're affecting the change. You're affecting the state of it. Pouring hot water onto tea leaves or onto tea essence, unless the latter has been kept hot on the Sabbath stove, which we'll get to in a minute. Melting down any solid. So melting anything. Melting, here it's not even having to do with food, but if you melted wax or something, or metals. Okay, so those are the malachot. Here are the Gizerot. These are the rabbinic enactments to keep us from getting to that point of the malacha. Scalding dried or smoked foods, drying wood in an oven, adding cold milk to hot tea, unless the latter is at 2 removes from the fire. I'll talk about that in a moment. It's called the second vessel, third vessel. And those are, again, those are ones that look like they resemble cooking, right? You're sticking the dry wood in the oven. You're not going to eat the wood, but it looks like you're putting in the oven for. It looks like you might be cooking something. Okay. I just want to say that, so when it comes to tea, because lots of people have tea on Shabbat, or coffee. It's mostly instant coffee, although I still don't see a problem for having fresh coffee, ground coffee, if you were to do it in this way. The issue is, again, with the heat. So what a lot of people do in their homes is, and this is what we do we have one of those pots that constantly have hot water, that's like an electric pot that just constantly has water. Or you could put it on some people have a stove going the whole time. The top of the range is called the stove. You'll have the fire going the whole time, and you'll have water in there. That is so hot that if you poured it directly onto tea leaves, it would be like cooking. That's the problem. So what do you do? Well, what we do is you have to, and again, it's funny because I just said it should be heating water to over 104 degrees is the malacha. But that's the assumption of that the vessel itself is warming up. But if you have one of these urns, these hot water urns, then to get the water, we have to take a ladle and take the water out. The ladle is now your vessel number 2. That's what he's referring to here as your second. Or you could pour the hot water into a teapot. And so that's your vessel number 2. And then pouring vessel number 2, the ladle filled with boiling water, or now it's a little less than boiling, or the teapot, where the hot water is sitting. Then when you pour that into your cup, which is your third vessel number 3, third vessel, it's not considered cooking, even though it might be a lot hotter than 100 degrees. It's just not considered because it's so many steps to get to the cup. So that's how most people make tea on Shabbat. I don't see why there's a problem. Some people tell me that don't know what I'm talking about with ground coffee, but I can't see the difference. If you have a French press, I don't see why, if you again did that method, you pour the boiling water into a teapot, then you take your teapot and you pour it into your
French press.
Your French press. It should be the same as with tea, because the coffee in that French press is just like the dried tea leaves. It's already roasted, but people tell me I'm wrong. So okay. So what people will do actually on Shabbat, if people want coffee, they have instant coffee, and you do the same thing as what you were doing with tea. So that's just something to know, that if you see people serving hot tea on Shabbat, that's what they're doing. It's taking a little while till the hot water gets into the teacup. And in which case, even if it's over 104 degrees, it's understood, because you've had these numerous steps, it's not the same level of cooking as malacha. Okay, so here's a Sabbath. What's a Sabbath stove? This is what he calls it. The prohibition of cooking does not mean that we may eat only cold food on the Sabbath. On the contrary, no Sabbath is considered complete without some hot food. So how do you do it? Well, he calls it a Sabbath stove. Usually you'll hear the Yiddish term is blech. A blech in Yiddish is a tin sheet, and that's how it originally was, although now they have electric ones, and we have something they call the unblech, which is a container which goes. It's a tin sheet, but it's a tin container, very thin container, where you pour hot water in the container, and then you put the cover over that, and so the water is in this contraption is kept really hot, and that allows you to achieve warm food. Because the problem with the blech is the tin can sometimes get really, really hot, in which case that's problematic, or it might burn the food, or it just, you can burn yourself on it. So anyway, so there's a lot of different, but usually the term you hear is blech. The prohibition, okay, so you want warm food. So what do? This means that one arranges the stove before the Sabbath in such a way that the actual burners are covered, and it's also impossible to regulate the heat on the Sabbath. So most traditional blechs are like an L shape. So it's flat over the stove, and then there's a little hook over, or a little strip that goes over the dials, so you can't, again, accidentally turn the dials, and make it impossible to regulate the heat on the Sabbath. Hot cooked food and an urn of hot water can then be placed on the stove before the commencement of the Sabbath, with the heat adjusted to keep them hot during the Sabbath until needed. So here again, you can't cook on the Sabbath, but you prepare beforehand on the Sabbath, and you take your warm food and you put it on the blech. Some people have the leniency, which we follow, of, and we have it's amazing. We have a stove that is made by, I don't know, one of the big manufacturers. It's, can't remember the name right now, but it's, which has a Shabbat mode. And the Shabbat mode is really very cool, because you set the oven to the temperature you want before Shabbat, and then you push the button, and the diagram goes off, so you can't manipulate it at all, and it just stays at that temperature. It overrides, that's what really the Sabbath mode is. It overrides the automatic shutoff, because most stoves, if you leave the stove on after most modern stoves, it'll go off after 6 hours. So the Shabbat mode overrides that, and it'll stay on for more than 6 hours. It'll stay on for the 24 hours until you turn it off. And but it stays at that consistent temperature. So therefore, we actually use our oven on Shabbat. We just put the food in the oven to keep it warm. And on Shabbat morning, if you want hot food, you also put it in the you can put it in the oven in the morning, and it just stays warm, or it warms up. Now, what most people, what you hear about very often as a Shabbat meal is cholent. Cholent is, and there's a Sephardi version of it as well, which I forget the name. But cholent is the Ashkenazi version. It's usually beans and if meat all mixed together. It's like a stew. And what happens is you put it in before Shabbat starts. You cook it a certain amount of the way. You don't have to cook the entire thing, but you cook it a certain amount of way. Or if these slow cookers, you put it in the slow cooker. You set it to go on at a certain time, and it just cooks in the slow cooker all of Shabbat. And then at mincha in the afternoon, your early evening meal, it's ready for you. So that's what cholent is. It's a Shabbat meal, because it is prepared. It is cooking over Shabbat very slowly on a continuous flame, which you've set up before Shabbat. So these are things that are ways to make sure that we have warm food on Shabbat. And this is really interesting, because it was a very important distinction between different types of Jews. During the early Middle Ages, there was a challenge to the rabbinic Jews, which is the kind of Jews that we think of ourselves as, a group called the Karaites. And the Karaites insisted that they were going back to the Bible. The Rabbinites didn't know what they were talking about. They had added all of these rules that were totally, had nothing to do with the Torah. And they made all of these decisions that were wrong. And they had their own method of interpretation. One of the distinctions is that they said, you Rabbinite Jews are breaking Shabbos every week. It says no fire on Shabbat. Not kindle. You're reading it as don't kindle. We understand it as no fire. So they did not have warm food. They didn't keep a fire going over Shabbat. They would have cold food on Shabbat. But,
excuse me, Rabbi, and that includes heating for their residents as well?
That's a good question. I do not know. That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I know that the Karaites, of course, are in the Middle East, because that's where the arguments were taking place. So maybe it wasn't such a big deal. They would not have a fire going. So I suppose, I don't know. I don't know enough. I just know that when it comes to cooking, they disagreed with the Rabbinites on the cooking.
And one last variation of that, did they subscribe to any notion of a Shabbos Goy?
No, we'll get to Shabbos Goys in a moment. What we're permitted to do. In fact, we're going to get to it right now.
That's me.
So here's some other observance terms to know about. So another term that is discussed on Shabbat is muktzah. Muktzah means excluded. And it's objects for which there is no use on Shabbat. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, you can't use money on." No, you can't. Money is forbidden on Shabbat. Well, it's true, but it's not because it's one of these malachot. You notice there was nothing here about doing business on Shabbat. Well, except for maybe, I suppose writing would be doing business. That would be a business one. In fact, making deals on Shabbat, even without writing it down, is a ra for writing. But in any case, there we go. In any case, money is something which is not allowed on Shabbat because there's no purpose for it. If you can't do business on Shabbat, then you certainly don't need money. Or another example of muktzah is something that didn't exist before Shabbat started, and then it just on Shabbat it appeared, like an egg. If a chicken laid an egg on Shabbat, you can't use that egg. Obviously, you can use eggs before Shabbat, but not an egg laid on Shabbat. And useless objects, things that have absolutely no purpose, a broken piece of pottery or a pebble that was on there's no reason to pick it up and play with it if it's because there's nothing you can do with it on Shabbat. So that's a term muktzah. So a lot of people, that's something you'll hear regularly discussed when they talk about Shabbat rules. An eruv is an interesting concept, which some people would say it's a legal fiction, but it allows. You're not allowed. We talked about you're not allowed to carry on Shabbat, so you can't take something from your house, anything, a piece of paper, and take it outside. Well, for a lot of, first of all, what if people are sharing meals and they want to, bring food to one another? So that's you can't do that if you can't carry. What about, a big one today is you can't push a baby stroller. So how would anybody bring their kids to shul, little ones at least, once they can walk on their own? Actually, if a child can walk on its own and you can pick it up, you can pick the baby up, the child up, the toddler up, because they can walk on their own. They just couldn't walk the whole way. Just like if somebody fell down walking to somewhere, you wouldn't say, well, too bad for you, I can't help you out. No, you can carry that person because they could carry themselves, and just at that moment they couldn't. But with a baby, you can't walk, and you can't carry it, and you can't push a baby stroller because that's kind of like carrying. So what do you do? So here's the solution. An eruv. It converts, it's a process by which you convert a large public domain into a private domain by surrounding an area with a partition to allow people to carry in the community. And in our Orthodox, here in South Bend, the Orthodox community has an eruv around their, basically where all the people live. And people make sure to live within this area called an eruv. And what they do is they basically tie a wire around this area, and the principle is that the wire that goes from one pole to another, it's basically like setting up door jams. There's just no walls. It's just one door jam after another. So that's the principle behind it. But the idea is you convert this by tying the community together with the partition. It allows people to carry. This is really important for many Orthodox communities because it allows people to take their kids to the synagogue, to go outside and to go from one house to the other and to take, go for walks, which of course, again, in our Orthodox community and many Orthodox communities which have large families, it's really important. Maybe they have smaller houses. It's very important to be able to get outside and to take the kids outside. So that's an eruv. Okay, last thing here is Shabbos Goy. Actually, this is something we talk about all the time. People talk about the Shabbos Goy. Very famous Shabbos Goy was Elvis Presley, which is actually connected to South Bend community in a way, because the rabbi who had been in South Bend moved, this is many, many years ago, what is it, 60, 80 years ago, moved to, where's Presley is, when they're in Tennessee? Memphis. Was it in Memphis? Yeah, was he Memphis, Tennessee, right? That's where he grew up. Anyway.
I think he's got a relative who's buried with a with a headstone with a star on it, a Mogan David.
Oh, well, this is the origin of why Elvis Presley was a Philo-Semite. So I'm pretty sure it's Memphis. He grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. That's where Graceland is. Anyway, he grew up. Rabbi Fruchter, who was the rabbi at Hebrew Orthodox Congregation, 70, 80 years ago, moves to Memphis, and little Elvis Presley is living in the same building. And they would need while you cannot ask, a Jewish person cannot ask a non-Jewish person to do anything that the Jew cannot do. You can't ask him to go cook for you. You can't ask him to do anything. You're not allowed. It's not permissible. However, there are some exceptions. In case of an illness, if somebody's very sick, you can ask them to help in some way that you wouldn't normally be able to do. Obviously, if deathly sick, you can do anything. But, we talked about medicine. So I suppose you could ask a non-Jewish person, Elliot's mother could have asked a non-Jewish person to grind up the antibiotic and put it in his yogurt. Okay? So that's an illness. Lighting a fire in cold weather, which is, I think, what Elvis Presley would do for that family. He would turn the heat on. Relieving the pain of an animal. Obviously, if you're a farmer and in a place where Jews were farmers, the animals also had a day off, and you didn't work the animals. But if the animal was in pain, you could ask a non-Jew to help with the animal. If the non-Jewish person says, I'm making a cup of coffee. You want a cup of coffee? You can say yes, even though you, the Jewish person, couldn't cook the coffee, and you couldn't ask the non-Jewish person to make a cup of coffee. But if the non-Jewish person says, I'm making coffee, would you like some? You're permitted to drink it. And actually, that was how, in this community, that was the justification when it was an Orthodox congregation. That was the justification for allowing the custodian to make coffee, because obviously making coffee in the coffee makers, I mean, that is cooking. That's not doing the three vessels that I described. Then you're putting it into an urn and you're cooking the coffee and you're boiling the coffee up. Well, Bland Jackson, who used to be the custodian, would make a cup of coffee for himself. He just happened to make 100 cups of coffee, and he would drink one, and then everybody else would feel comfortable drinking the coffee. However, I think for us in our congregation today, we have custodians. We have non-Jewish custodians, and we contract with them to do certain duties before the Sabbath. So they make, so all of these things are permitted because this is their regular duty. They usually do these things. So turning on the lights and the such. So that's the rules about a non-Jewish person by the term that people know it, which is really not a very nice term, but the Shabbos goy, but really you shouldn't be one. You shouldn't use a non-Jewish. You shouldn't take advantage of a non-Jewish person, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So Joni, don't let Steve take advantage of you that way.
I was thinking the very exact thing.
Okay, so here's all the things we talked about tonight. And I'd say this is the most important slide. Do I really have to do all this to observe Shabbat? You're like, oh my God, what's wrong with these people? So I think it's important for us to say, in the world we live in, okay, we are not Orthodox Jews for lots and lots of reasons. And maybe some of you will want to be an Orthodox Jew one day, and that's great. But for those of us who are not Orthodox Jews, the world that we live in, we want to make, and those of us, including myself, I am not coming from a traditional family. I'm the Rosenzweigian Jew. I'm not coming from a traditional family that we did all these things all the time, and so it's second nature what Shabbos is to me. Shabbos, when I was growing up, was a regular week, was a Saturday. And so when I became more observant, the goal was, well, what do I need to make Shabbat special? Obviously, as an observant Jew, I do take these things seriously, but the main thing is it's not second nature, and sometimes when you look at these rules, and especially the Gezerot, those rabbinic enactments, it just makes you so weary. It seems like such a burden. And so we need to make Shabbat joyful. We need to make it a special day of the week. And to be joyful, we really need to work hard to make Shabbat different from the other days of the week. So the real question is, how can I make Shabbat a day that helps us, in the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, mend our tattered lives? And there's all different ways. I mean, what I put, a professor of Talmud at Northwestern, Barry Wimpheimer, is a great guy, and he actually he got Orthodox rabbinic ordination, but he is moved more to the left as he's had a family, kids, especially girls. And he talks about the term. I should have mentioned the term for a person. The Hebrew term for a person who observes Shabbat is a shomer Shabbat. Remember, we looked at those verses last week, and one in the Deuteronomy code of the Ten Commandments, it says Shomor et Yom HaShabbat, and in the Exodus version, it says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. So the term shomer, which means to keep or to observe, that's the term that most people use. In fact, in the Orthodox world, that's a very common term to describe who, they don't call themselves Orthodox Jews, they'll call themselves a shomer Shabbat. That is, they're taking Shabbat very carefully, they're observing all of these mitzvot and these rules that we've been talking about, and they're very cautious about people interacting with people who don't. So they're a shomer Shabbat. But this Barry Wimpheimer says we have to learn to be a zocher Shabbat. Zocher are all the positive things you got to do on Shabbat: make kiddush, have festive meals, daven, have the Shabbat liturgy. So he says, really, let's be zocher Shabbat. And so that's what I say here. We can always be zocher Shabbat, even if we can't always live up to shomer Shabbat. Zocher Shabbat is making Shabbat a really good day, a different day the rest of the week. I've said, if people work hard these days, 6 days a week, 2 parents work, there's never, discretionary time is hard to come by. If Friday night is the family night to go to watch a movie, then maybe that's Shabbat. Um, Years ago, there was a great Aiden Steinsaltz, who was one of the great teachers of our generation. He's the one who it's his English translation of the Talmud that many people use today, and there was a Jerusalem Post journalist who decided to go visit Aiden Steinsaltz's Talmud classes. This was a happening thing. This was about 30, 40 years ago, and I guess 35 years ago in Israel. And he decided to go to this Talmud class. He heard it, and because Rabbi Steinsaltz, though he was aligned himself with Lubavitch Judaism, he was very open to secular Jews. And the journalist goes into the study group, and he says, Rabbi Steinsaltz, I just want you to know that every Shabbat I eat bacon and eggs. And Rabbi Steinsaltz said to him, well, it's not exactly the way I would observe Shabbat, but at least you're doing something different. So that's kind of the way that I think that we should be observing and remembering Shabbat these days. That's what I like what are the ways that we can make Shabbat special? And that's my last thing here. Thoughts. What are ways? Meals, activities, connection with Jewish community. What are the ways? And I think that's really what we should be focused on is when we think about Shabbat. And next week, what we'll do is we will go through the Shabbat day, including the Shabbat rituals or meals Friday night, and then lunch, which is a little bit less, and talk a little bit about the afternoon, what we do. So that's our last week of Shabbat activities. But I don't know, any other thoughts that people have themselves done to make Shabbat special, in your own lives, if you thought about it. Yeah, Elliot?
Yeah, I kind of was talking to a Jewish friend about Shabbat before and what is considered work or not, and he was kind of just it can really be what you feel is work and what you feel is restful to you, if doing something drawing, or what if you're a story writer and that's something that you really enjoy, that's restful that could be restful to you and not work in the sense of breaking Shabbat.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that if you're a professional story writer, I don't know if I would say that, well, that's what you should do on Shabbat. But if that's something that you really enjoy doing, and that you have some other profession, yeah, I think that's really special. That's a way to make it. That's the time I have to write stories, or that's the time I'm going to focus on it, because maybe there are other days in the week, but that every Shabbat I look forward to Shabbat, because that's when I'm going to sit down and hammer out some of these ideas I got. Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah.
Dennis Prager, who's not somebody I usually appreciate all that much, but he has written a number of things about Judaism. And he is a very always promoting Judaism. He once talked about, and I guess he grew up kind of nominally Orthodox, but he said in a talk once he always hated walking on Shabbat. And as soon as he could drive, or he was an adult, even wherever he went to shul, he always drove. He was not walking. That was not his thing. So he said, but what I do is that on Shabbat in my car, I only play Jewish music while I'm driving to the synagogue. I only, I have, and I sing along to the Shabbat melodies, and that makes it a Shabbat car. Okay, so that's because that is something that the conservative movement, um, one of the in the 50s already. This is very interesting how religion and sociology mix. So the conservative movement, which is today the smallest of the three movements, major denominations of Judaism or movements of Judaism, um, in the 50s and 60s, we were the biggies. We were the biggest, even in the 40s, I think, because what was happening is by the 40s, maybe even by the 30s, but certainly by the 40s and 50s, we were already in second generation Judaism, right? These were second generation, well, either first American generation, right? The parents were immigrants. In the 30s and 40s, you've got kids growing up and adults who are second generation, and they're making it in America. They're middle class, and they're moving to the growing suburbs, and all of a sudden you don't have people living in the neighborhood in the urban neighborhood to walk to the synagogue anymore. And so now people are living out, in whatever the suburb is, and the only way to get to the synagogue is to drive. So the conservative movement wrote, I don't think I would call it exactly a tshuva, a responsum, legal responsum. It was kind of more like a guidance, Shabbat guidance, saying it's okay to drive on Shabbat if you only drive to the synagogue. Now, the problem with that is, of course, to drive on Shabbat, I mean, there's no way to drive on the Sabbath. Maybe an electric car you could, with certain interpretations of what electricity is, because not everybody agrees whether electricity is similar to kindling a fire. Most people do, but some people don't, and argue it's not like that, and so people will use electricity on the Shabbat. So maybe with an electric car, you might be able to argue for that. But with the cars we drive, you're starting a fire every time you start the car. Plus, you got to carry your wallet, you got to carry things. I mean, there's just no way to justify it. But the conservative movement said, well, it's okay because otherwise you're going to be stuck at home on Shabbat. I mean, if you're living in a suburb and it's 5 miles from the synagogue, you probably won't come, and you'll be by yourself, and you'll be alone, and it's not, Shabbat should be a time, again, Zocher Shabbat. You've got to be with Jewish community. So they said, okay to drive. Now, of course, what happens then is everybody drives everywhere. But the idea was that driving was okay. But what I think about Prager's solution is, okay, so I'm not going to justify that driving is somehow okay, but when I do drive, I'm going to make it unique. I'm going to make that experience in itself unique. And I think that that's it's the Zocher Shabbat. It's making Shabbat special. So these are all different ways, and everybody can come up with their own. And to me, and again, this is my approach to Judaism anyway, in the world we live in, anytime we are compelled to think about why I'm doing what I'm doing and how it relates to my Jewish experience, that's a good thing. So we talked about kashrut, and if a person goes into a non-kosher, is okay with, whether even if people have kosher homes, but they go into non-kosher restaurants and eat, if a person goes into the non-kosher restaurant to eat and they look at the menu and they say, I can't have the pork chops, but I'll have the steak as long as the steak doesn't have any dairy products with it. You're not cooking it in butter, or you're just cooking it, frying it up. You're already making a decision saying, I'm not eating the pork, which is your specialty. I'm eating something that I find is acceptable to me. Or I'll eat or even better, I'll have a vegetarian dish in this non-kosher restaurant. There's no way that vegetarian dish wasn't cooked in a pan or a pot that was somehow washed or had non-kosher food in it. But you're saying, I'm making a choice. I can't be perfect. It's not my house. But I'm going to eat something that I'm eating this because I can't eat that. You're already making a choice about your Jewish. You're making a Jewish choice. Same thing with Shabbat. If you're doing something different on Shabbat, saying, I'm not doing this, but I'm doing that because today's Shabbat, you're already, as far as I'm concerned, celebrating Shabbat the way it's supposed to be celebrated. Obviously, the more serious we take Shabbat, the more it can be meaningful to us. But at the same time, we do want to connect with community. So if we live, very far away from a synagogue, just because we've made that choice for whatever reason, school district, house, we like that house, we like the neighborhood, you've made a choice, and the synagogue is far away, all right, so you got to drive. So you have to make those decisions. Those are just realistic things we do in this world. So, but I felt it was very important at least to talk about more traditional observances, so that that's what tradition tells us, but we have to balance in some way. So, all right, we've got one more week of Shabbat, and then we take almost a month break because we'll be on vacation. We'll be in Canada for a couple of weeks. So, all right. So next week we'll have we'll go through the entire meal, dinner, lunch, afternoon meal, all at once. So don't eat too much before then because we'll be eating so many meals all at once. All right. Very good. Hope everybody has a good evening.
Thank you.
All right.
You
Take
too.
care.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have
Bye.
a good night.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.